September 15, 1987. Frank Garrison had led 17 successful operations for the agency. He trusted his team with his life. That's exactly why none of them saw the betrayal coming. The coordinates led them 12 miles into Colombian jungle. 6 men. Full tactical gear. Mission parameters: destroy Escobar's chemical laboratory and eliminate all witnesses. Frank checked his watch. 0347 hours. Right on schedule. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything the CIA thought they knew about Operation Nightfall. Emergency cables flew between Langley and Bogota. 3 deputy directors resigned within a month. And for 35 years, when intelligence officers talked about Colombia, they always came back to this night. The night Frank Garrison's team walked into their own execution. The night one man learned that some secrets are worth more than blood. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The first bullet shattered bark 3 inches from Frank's head. He hit the jungle floor as automatic fire erupted from positions that shouldn't have existed, positions his own reconnaissance had cleared 6 hours earlier. The muzzle flashes strobed through the darkness like deadly fireflies, and Frank's tactical mind processed the impossible geometry of betrayal. They were surrounded. "Contact left! Contact right!" Rodriguez screamed into his radio, but static answered back. Their communications were dead. Had been dead, Frank realized with ice-cold certainty, probably since they'd crossed the Rio Magdalena. Thompson went down first, crimson blooming across his chest as he tried to reach cover. Martinez lasted 3 seconds longer, his rifle chattering defiance before a burst from the tree line cut him down. Frank rolled behind a massive cecropia trunk, bark exploding around him as automatic fire tracked his movement. "Frank," Chen's voice, desperate and fading. "The lab, it's not what—" The words ended in a wet gurgle. Frank pressed his face into the rotting jungle floor, tasting copper and earth. 5 men down in 30 seconds. The mathematics of slaughter. But there was something wrong with this ambush, beyond the fact that it existed. The shooters knew exactly where each team member would be. They'd waited for his men to spread into their standard tactical formation before opening fire. This wasn't cartel security responding to an intrusion. This was an execution choreographed with surgical precision. Frank's earpiece crackled with a voice he recognized. Johnson, their handler back in Bogota. "Phoenix team, report status. Static." Then, "Phoenix team is compromised." Say again, "Phoenix team is compromised." But Johnson's voice held no surprise, no urgency, just the flat tone of a man reading from a script he'd written himself. Frank stayed pressed to the jungle floor as boots approached through the undergrowth. Spanish voices, low and professional. Sicarios, but not the usual cartel muscle. These moved like soldiers, like men who'd been briefed on exactly what they'd find here. "Donde está el último? Where's the last one?" "Se fue hacia el laboratorio." He went toward the lab. They thought he'd run deeper into the jungle. Frank waited, counting heartbeats, until their voices faded. Then he moved. The laboratory sat in a clearing 200 meters ahead, exactly where the satellite imagery had promised. But as Frank approached through the dense undergrowth, details emerged that made his blood freeze. Guard towers with American equipment. Prefab buildings that looked suspiciously like CIA field stations. And walking between the structures, men in tactical gear who moved with the easy confidence of operators, not cartel security. Through his scope, Frank watched a figure emerge from the main building. Tall, lean, wearing the same combat fatigues as his dead team. The man turned, and moonlight illuminated a face Frank knew from a dozen briefings at Langley. Deputy Director William Marchetti, the man who'd personally handed Frank his mission parameters 72 hours ago. Frank's finger found his radio transmitter, muscle memory overriding disbelief. But he stopped before keying the mic. Who would he call? Johnson was compromised. Maybe the entire chain of command. Maybe everyone who knew Operation Nightfall existed. A sound made him freeze. Boots on leaves, moving with practiced stealth. Frank turned to find a young woman crouched behind a water tank, maybe 19, wearing a stained lab coat. She'd been crying, and her hands shook as she pointed toward the main building. Ayúdame, she whispered. Help me. ¿Quién eres? Frank kept his voice low. Mi padre trabajaba aquí. Los Americanos. She gestured helplessly toward the building where Marchetti had disappeared. Her father worked here. The Americans. Frank understood. This wasn't Escobar's laboratory. The coordinates, the satellite photos, the entire operation. It had all been manufactured to bring his team to this place, to eliminate witnesses to something that officially didn't exist. A black site, a CIA facility deep in cartel territory, doing work that couldn't happen on American soil. But what kind of work required murdering an entire agency team? The girl grabbed his arm. Mi padre está muerto. Me dijeron que todos los testigos. They told her all witnesses had to die. Frank looked at this terrified young woman and made a choice that would haunt him for 35 years. He couldn't save his team, but he could save her. ¿Cómo te llamas? What's your name? Elena. Elena Vasquez. Elena, I'm going to get you out of here. As they moved through the jungle toward the extraction point that Frank now knew would never come, Elena pressed something into his hand. A photograph, Frank's team arriving at the LZ 12 hours earlier. Someone had been documenting Operation Nightfall from the beginning. Someone had planned this execution down to the last detail. And now Frank Garrison, the sole survivor of a mission that officially never happened, carried the only evidence that could expose the truth about what the agency was really doing in Colombia, if he could survive long enough to use it. The photograph crumpled in Frank's fist as they pushed deeper into the jungle, Elena's labored breathing the only sound beyond the distant shouts of search teams. The image, his team's arrival, captured by unknown eyes, felt like holding his own death warrant. Every step away from the compound carried them further from answers and deeper into questions that had no good endings. Elena stumbled, catching herself against a strangler fig. In the filtered moonlight, Frank could see the exhaustion etched into her young face, the way terror had aged her beyond her 19 years. She reminded him of someone, though the memory flickered just beyond reach, lost in the adrenaline fog of betrayal and blood. How far? She whispered in Spanish. Frank checked his compass, though he knew the answer would taste like ashes. 2 kilometers to the extraction point. What he didn't say, the helicopter wouldn't come. Marchetti had made sure of that when he'd orchestrated this execution masquerading as a mission. They moved in silence through the cathedral darkness of primary growth forest. Frank's mind cataloged survival priorities, water, shelter, evasion routes, while a deeper part of him grappled with the magnitude of what he'd witnessed. Not just his team's murder, but the existence of an entire black site operation hidden in cartel territory. The kind of facility that required congressional oversight, Senate Intelligence Committee approval, dozens of signatures from people who supposedly had no idea it existed, which meant the betrayal reached far beyond Marchetti. Elena pressed close as they navigated a maze of buttress routes, her fear a palpable thing in the humid air. My father, she said in careful English, he made medicines for sick children in Medellin. They promised him laboratory, good equipment, chance to help people. Frank's throat tightened. What kind of medicines? For pain, for soldiers hurt in the fighting. Her voice broke, but then came the others. Men who spoke English like you. They changed everything, made him work on different things, things that hurt people instead of helping. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Chemical weapons development, biological agents, research that couldn't happen on American soil without triggering international incidents. So they'd found a talented chemist, manipulated his humanitarian instincts, then transformed his laboratory into something monstrous. And when that chemist's conscience finally rebelled, they'd killed him. Just like they'd killed Frank's team when their mission brought them too close to the truth. Elena, Frank said carefully, did your father keep records? Notes about his work? She nodded, pulling a small leather journal from inside her lab coat. Always. He said science without documentation is just guessing. Frank stared at the journal, understanding with crystal clarity why Elena had become a liability. That book likely contained evidence of war crimes, chemical weapons treaties violated, Geneva Convention protocols shattered. In the wrong hands, or the right ones, depending on perspective, it could topple governments. They reached the extraction point as dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of copper and gold. The clearing sat empty, morning mist rising from dew-soaked grass. No helicopter, no rescue, just the sound of howler monkeys welcoming another day in a jungle that had become Frank's prison. Elena sank onto a fallen log, clutching her father's journal. "They're not coming, are they?" "No," Frank said simply. Lies served no purpose now. She nodded, as if she'd expected nothing else. "What do we do?" Frank studied this young woman who'd lost everything in a single night, whose only crime had been loving a father naive enough to believe in American promises. In her dark eyes, he saw something that reminded him of his sister Sarah back in Virginia, the same quiet strength, the same refusal to surrender even when surrender seemed rational. Sarah, who'd written him letters throughout his deployments, who'd promised to have Sunday dinner waiting when he finally came home for good. Sarah, who believed her big brother worked in diplomatic security and spent his overseas assignments protecting embassy personnel from generic foreign threats. If Frank died in this jungle, Sarah would eventually receive a visit from men in dark suits who'd feed her carefully constructed lies about training accidents and classified memorial services. She'd spend the rest of her life believing he'd died serving his country, never knowing he'd been murdered by it. The thought crystallized his resolve. "We survive," he told Elena. "We get out of Colombia, and then we make sure the world knows what happened here." Elena gripped the journal tighter. "You would do this? Risk everything to expose them?" Frank looked at her, this brave young woman whose father had died trying to do the right thing, and made a promise that would define the next 35 years of his life. Sometimes that's all the choice you have left. In the distance, helicopters began their search pattern. Frank shouldered his pack, checked his weapons, and led Elena into the jungle depths. Behind them lay death and betrayal. Ahead lay an uncertain journey toward a truth the world wasn't ready to hear. But Frank Garrison had made his choice. Now came the hard part, living with it. 15 years later. The doorbell of Garrison Hardware and Supply chimed with the same tired note it had made for 3,000 mornings, but this time, the sound cut through Frank's consciousness like a blade. He looked up from the inventory spreadsheet that had been holding his attention with the desperate focus of a man who'd learned to find peace in mundane details. The young woman standing in his doorway was soaked in blood. Frank's coffee mug hit the counter, ceramic shattering against wood as muscle memory snapped him into combat awareness. His hand moved toward the Glock hidden beneath the register before conscious thought caught up with instinct. This wasn't Columbia. This was Millbrook, Virginia, population 3,847, where the most dangerous thing that happened was teenagers drag racing on Route 29. But the woman swaying in his doorway was speaking rapid Spanish, her voice thick with terror and exhaustion, and clutched in her trembling hand was a photograph that made Frank's blood freeze. "Por favor," she gasped, stumbling forward. "You are Francisco Garrison, yes? You knew my mother, Elena Vasquez." The photograph fluttered to the floor between them. Frank stared down at his own face, 35 years younger, standing beside Elena in jungle fatigues. The image he'd thought was lost forever, buried in classified files and official denials. The woman, Elena's daughter, Christ, Elena had a daughter, collapsed against his counter. "They killed her," she whispered in English, accented with the same careful cadence he remembered from her mother. 3 days ago in Bogota. But before she died, she told me to find Francisco Garrison in Virginia. She said you were the only one who would understand." Frank's carefully constructed world tilted on its axis. Elena was dead. The brave 19-year-old he'd led through 100 miles of Colombian jungle, who'd survived assassination attempts and government cover-ups, who'd disappeared into deep cover with her father's journal and a promise to stay hidden. Elena was dead. "What's your name?" Frank asked, though he already knew the answer would change everything. "Carmen. Carmen Vasquez." She looked up at him with Elena's eyes, Elena's stubborn defiance even in the face of terror. "My mother, she never told me about Colombia until 3 days ago. Never told me about the laboratory, about what the Americans did to my grandfather. But when the men came for her, when they started asking about the journal..." "The journal." Frank's hands shook as he helped Carmen to the back office, mind racing through 15 years of careful planning suddenly rendered useless. He'd built Frank Garrison, small-town hardware store owner, into the perfect cover identity. Boring, invisible, the kind of man who existed in plain sight without drawing attention from anyone. He'd married a local teacher, coached Little League, served on the volunteer fire department. He was beloved by his neighbors precisely because he was unremarkable, all of it crashing down because of a photograph and a young woman who carried her mother's courage like a genetic inheritance. Carmen pulled something from inside her jacket, a leather journal, its pages stained with what Frank prayed was only dirt and sweat. The same journal Elena's father had kept, documenting the transformation of his humanitarian medical research into weapons of mass destruction. "Mama kept it safe all these years," Carmen said. "But last week, someone leaked that the journal existed, old CIA files, declassified by accident. By the time Mama realized what had happened, she didn't need to finish." Frank understood the mathematics of exposure. Once the journal's existence became known, Elena had become a liability that needed elimination. Carmen, too, by association. Frank stared at the journal, seeing in its yellowed pages the death of everything he'd built in Millbrook. His wife Beth would learn that her husband of 12 years was a fiction. His neighbors would discover that the man who'd helped them through hurricanes and harvest festivals was a trained killer who'd spent decades running from his own government. Sarah still lived 2 counties over, still believed her brother had died heroically in a training accident. The doorbell chimed again. Through the front window, Frank saw a black sedan pulling into the parking lot. Government plates. 2 men in suits that cost more than most of his neighbors made in a month. "Back door," Frank said, grabbing Carmen's arm. "Now." But even as they moved, Frank knew running would only delay the inevitable. They'd found him. After 15 years of perfect invisibility, Elena's death had exposed the one loose thread that could unravel everything. As Carmen clutched her mother's journal and Frank led her toward the alley behind his store, he felt the last pieces of his carefully constructed life falling away. Frank Garrison, hardware store owner, was about to die. What emerged from those ashes would be someone he'd hoped never to become again. The hunter, the killer. The man who'd made a promise in a Colombian jungle and spent 35 years trying to keep it. Now the past had returned to collect its due. Frank's hands trembled as he guided Carmen through the maze of paint cans and gardening supplies toward the rear exit. The familiar weight of the Glock pressed against his ribs, but 15 years of peaceful routine had dulled his tactical edge. He caught himself moving too quickly, making noise, forgetting the careful choreography that had once kept him alive in places where mistakes meant death. "Wait," he whispered, pressing his ear to the back door. The alley beyond had always been his planned escape route, but planning and execution were different animals. Through the front windows he could hear car doors slamming, the measured footsteps of professionals who knew their target couldn't run far. Carmen's breathing came in shallow gasps. Her mother's journal clutched against her chest like armor. "They followed me," she said in Spanish, the words thick with guilt. "I tried to be careful, but—" "Not your fault." Frank checked the security monitor that showed the alley, empty for now, but that wouldn't last. These weren't local police responding to a disturbance. Government plates meant federal resources, which meant satellite surveillance, traffic cameras, facial recognition algorithms already processing every angle of his face. "How long since your mother died?" 3 days. I've been driving since then, sleeping in the car." Carmen's voice cracked. "I didn't know where else to go. Mama said you saved her once. Said you were the only person who knew the truth about what happened." The front door chimed again. Frank peered through the gap between inventory shelves, watching 2 men in charcoal suits examine his store with the clinical detachment of predators. The taller one spoke into a radio while the shorter one photographed Frank's customer counter, the broken coffee mug, the blood drops Carmen had tracked across his floor. Frank's neighbor Dale Hutchins chose that moment to bang through the front entrance with his usual morning enthusiasm. "Frank, you seen my—" Dale stopped mid-sentence, taking in the federal agents with the slow confusion of a man who'd never imagined his quiet town intersecting with anything requiring government attention. "Store's closed," the tall agent said, his voice carrying the flat authority of someone accustomed to immediate compliance. "Closed? Frank never closes during—" Dale's protest died as the shorter agent stepped closer, letting his suit jacket fall open to reveal the shoulder holster beneath. I'll come back later." Frank watched his neighbor retreat, seeing in Dale's frightened compliance the first crack in his carefully constructed life. By noon, half of Millbrook would know that federal agents had taken over Garrison Hardware. By evening, the speculation would have transformed into certainty that Frank was involved in something dark and dangerous. Beth would hear it at the elementary school where she taught 4th grade. She'd drive home expecting answers that Frank couldn't give without destroying whatever remained of the man she'd married. The thought of her sitting at their kitchen table, waiting for an explanation that would never come, made his chest tighten with a different kind of fear than anything Columbia had taught him. Francisco? Carmen's whisper pulled him back to the immediate crisis. The back door. Frank shook his head. Through the security monitor, he could see movement in the alley. A third vehicle, more agents taking positions. They'd done this before, and they'd learned from whatever mistakes had allowed Elena to survive as long as she had. The tall agent's radio crackled with a voice Frank couldn't quite hear, but the man's response was clear, negative. No sign of the target or the girl. Expand the perimeter. No sign. Frank frowned, studying the agent's body language more carefully. They were searching, not apprehending, which meant they knew he was here but hadn't pinpointed his location. The blood trail, the broken mug, Carmen's obvious distress. They'd found evidence of contact but not proof of current presence. His phone buzzed with a text message. "Beth, running late today. Emergency faculty meeting. Love you." Relief flooded through him, followed immediately by the cold realization that her absence wouldn't last. Beth would come home to find her life dismantled by secrets her husband had carried for longer than they'd known each other. "There's another way," Frank said, leading Carmen deeper into the store's storage area. A maintenance tunnel connected his building to the old textile mill next door, installed during renovations he'd overseen specifically for this contingency. He'd told the contractors it was for emergency access to the electrical systems. In reality, it was his acknowledgement that Frank Garrison's peaceful existence might someday require Francisco Garrison's survival skills. Carmen followed him into the cramped tunnel, her mother's journal protected inside her jacket. As they crawled through decades-old dust and spiderwebs, Frank's mind raced through contingencies he'd hoped never to implement. Safe houses, cash reserves, weapons caches. All the infrastructure of a man who'd never quite believed his past would let him rest. Behind them, he could hear the agents beginning their methodical search of his store. Soon they'd find the tunnel entrance, but by then Frank and Carmen would be gone, vanishing into the network of backroads and forgotten places that surrounded Millbrook like protective armor. The problem was, armor only worked if you never took it off. Basements smelled like rust and abandonment, 30 years of Virginia humidity slowly reclaiming what men had built. Frank helped Carmen through the tunnel's exit, her mother's journal still pressed against her ribs like a talisman that had already failed once. Dust motes danced in the weak sunlight filtering through broken windows, and for a moment Frank was 17 again, exploring condemned buildings with his sister Sarah, both of them pretending the world held nothing more dangerous than tetanus and angry security guards. Sarah. The thought of her hit him like a physical blow. She lived 40 minutes away in Charlottesville, still sending him birthday cards that read "To my hero brother" in her careful teacher's handwriting. Still believing the story he'd constructed about diplomatic security, overseas assignments protecting embassy personnel from vague foreign threats. She had no idea that her hero brother was a coward who'd spent 15 years hiding behind paint cans and lawnmower repairs. "Where do we go now?" Carmen whispered, and Frank heard Elena's voice in her cadence. The same careful pronunciation, the same stubborn strength wrapped in uncertainty. Frank peered through a grimy window toward the street. His store sat 2 blocks away, black sedans positioned like chess pieces around a board he should have seen developing. But he'd grown soft in Millbrook's embrace, lulled by the fiction that good intentions could somehow balance the scales of what he'd done, what he'd failed to do. "There's a cabin," he said. 40 miles north, in the state forest. Off the grid. He didn't mention that the cabin was where he'd planned to bring Beth if this day ever came, where they'd have time for him to explain 35 years of deception before deciding whether their marriage was worth preserving. Now Carmen would hear those confessions instead, and Beth would learn the truth from federal agents who specialized in weaponizing people's secrets against them. They moved through the mill's gutted interior, past machinery that had once employed half the town before global economics made Millbrook's textile operations as obsolete as Frank's operational skills. Or so he'd thought. His hands remembered the weight of the Glock, the calculated angles of cover and concealment, the mathematics of violence that no amount of suburban domesticity could completely erase. Carmen stumbled over debris, catching herself against a rusted loom. "My mother never told me," she said suddenly. 34 years, and she never told me my grandfather wasn't just a chemist, never told me about the laboratory, about what they made him do. She was protecting you. Frank helped her navigate a collapsed section of flooring, noting how Carmen instinctively moved to minimize noise despite her obvious exhaustion. Elena had trained her daughter well, even if Carmen didn't realize it. Some secrets are too dangerous to share. Like yours? Carmen's eyes found his in the dim light. Like whatever you've been running from? Frank stopped walking. In the distance, he could hear helicopters beginning their search patterns, the rhythmic thump of rotors that transported him instantly back to Colombian skies and the smell of cordite and burning vegetation. Carmen deserved better than Elena's carefully constructed half-truths. She deserved better than Frank's comfortable lies. "We weren't supposed to save your mother," he said. "My team, Operation Nightfall. We were sent to eliminate everyone in that laboratory. Your grandfather, your mother, the technicians. Anyone who knew what was really happening there." Carmen's face went pale. "But you saved her. You got her out." "I saved her." Frank's throat felt like sandpaper. "But I left the others to die. Your grandfather, 3 Colombian chemists, 2 graduate students from Universidad Nacional. I could have warned them, could have given them time to escape. Instead, I grabbed Elena and ran while my teammates murdered everyone else in that facility." The confession hung between them like a physical presence. Frank had never spoken those words aloud, not in 15 years of marriage to Beth, not during the classified debriefings that had officially closed Operation Nightfall, not even to himself in the dark hours when whiskey couldn't quite silence his conscience. "Why?" Carmen's voice was barely audible. "Why only my mother?" Frank closed his eyes, seeing Elena's 19-year-old face in the laboratory's harsh fluorescent light, seeing the trust she'd placed in the American operative who'd promised to help her father escape, seeing his own reflection in her eyes as he made the calculation that would define the rest of his existence. "Because she reminded me of my sister," he said. "Because in that moment, faced with orders that turned my stomach, I could save one person, and I chose her. It was selfish. It was unprofessional. It got my entire team killed when the operation went sideways." Carmen absorbed this revelation with Elena's same quiet strength. Outside, the helicopter sounds were getting closer, and Frank knew their window was shrinking. But Carmen deserved the complete truth before they ran again. "The journal your mother carried, it didn't just document chemical weapons research. It contained evidence that American intelligence was conducting illegal human experimentation on Colombian civilians. Your grandfather's medicines were being tested on kidnapped villagers, prisoners, anyone whose disappearance wouldn't trigger investigations." Carmen's grip tightened on the journal. "And now they want it back. Now they want it buried." Frank started moving again, leading her toward the mill's rear exit. "Along with everyone who knows what's in it, including you." Frank nodded, accepting the weight of 35 years of borrowed time. "Including me." As they reached the mill's rear exit, Frank's phone buzzed with an incoming call. The caller ID made his blood freeze. Marcus Webb. Frank stared at the screen, his finger hovering over the decline button. Marcus Webb had been dead for 35 years, killed in the laboratory explosion that ended Operation Nightfall. Frank had carried his teammates' dog tags out of Colombia, had attended the memorial service where Marcus's mother wept over a flag-draped coffin that held nothing but sand and lies. "Answer it," Carmen whispered, reading the shock on his face. Frank's thumb moved without conscious direction, accepting the call. The voice that emerged from the speaker was older, weathered by decades, but unmistakably familiar. "Hello, Francisco. Been a long time." Frank's legs nearly buckled. He pressed his back against the mill's concrete wall, phone trembling in his grip. "Marcus? But you're—" "Dead? Yeah, that was the idea. Marcus's laugh carried the same bitter edge Frank remembered from their training days at Langley. Amazing how easy it is to die when the right people want you disappeared. Almost as easy as staying dead for 35 years while you play hardware store owner in bumfuck Virginia. The helicopter sounds were closer now, and Frank realized with sickening clarity that they weren't searching randomly. They were herding him toward this conversation, toward this moment of revelation that would redefine everything he thought he knew about Operation Nightfall. "The laboratory," Frank said, pieces clicking into place with the precision of a well-oiled weapon. "You knew. Before we went in, you already knew what we'd find." "I knew we weren't there to shut down Pablo Escobar's chemical weapons program, if that's what you mean." Marcus's voice carried the satisfied tone of a man who'd waited decades to deliver this truth. "See, there's something you never understood about Operation Nightfall, Francisco. Something that might have saved you years of guilt if you'd been smart enough to figure it out." Carmen was staring at Frank with growing comprehension, her mother's journal clutched against her chest. The same journal Frank had believed contained evidence of American complicity in war crimes. The same journal that had gotten Elena killed and was now threatening Carmen's life. "The laboratory wasn't Escobar's," Marcus continued. "It was ours. Had been for 2 years before your team ever set foot in Colombia. Every chemical weapon, every human experiment, every atrocity documented in that journal your little girlfriend is carrying. All of it authorized by the same people who sent us to clean up the mess when congressional oversight started sniffing around." Frank closed his eyes, but the images wouldn't stop. Elena's father working frantically in the laboratory's sterile environment. The fear in Elena's eyes when Frank burst through the door. The explosion that was supposed to kill everyone inside, eliminating witnesses to a black site operation that violated every international treaty America had signed. "You were never there to save anyone," Marcus said, his voice gentle with false compassion. "You were there to be the patsy, the rogue operative who went soft and compromised the mission, the convenient explanation for why Operation Nightfall went sideways, and everyone died except the one man whose conscience couldn't handle the orders." The phone felt like it weighed 1,000 pounds in Frank's hand. "The team, Rodriguez, Patterson, Zhang. Oh, they're dead. Very dead. Had to be for the story to work. See, we needed one survivor to carry the guilt, to sell the narrative that good Americans died because Frank Garrison couldn't follow orders. You've been our star witness for 35 years, Francisco. Living proof that the operation failed because of human weakness, not systemic corruption." Carmen stepped closer, her face reflecting the same sick understanding that was spreading through Frank's chest like poison. Outside, the helicopters circled with mechanical precision, waiting for something Frank was only beginning to comprehend. "Elena," Frank whispered. "Elena was supposed to die with her father. You saving her was the one variable we couldn't control. The one piece of genuine heroism in an otherwise perfect frame job. But don't worry, we've spent 35 years cleaning up that loose end. Amazing how many accidents a person can survive when we need them alive to keep tabs on our favorite patsy." Frank's knees hit the concrete floor. Every memory from that night was rewriting itself in his mind. The way Marcus had volunteered for point position despite protocol. The convenient equipment failure that separated Frank from the rest of the team. The explosion that came exactly 60 seconds too early, before the building was fully evacuated. "You killed them," Frank said. "Your own teammates." "I followed orders. Just like you should have." Marcus's voice hardened. "Now here's what's going to happen. You're going to walk out that back door with the girl and the journal. You're going to get in the helicopter that's waiting for you, and you're going to disappear. Into the same hole where Frank Garrison has been hiding for 15 years, except this time you won't be coming back." "And if I refuse?" Marcus's answer came with the cold finality of a closing coffin lid. "Then Beth learns exactly what kind of monster she married before she joins Elena in whatever afterlife failed mothers go to." Frank ended the call with Marcus, but didn't move from the concrete floor. The phone slipped from his numb fingers, clattering against the mill's debris-strewn ground. Carmen knelt beside him, her hand finding his shoulder with the same gentle pressure Elena had used that night in Colombia, when she'd bandaged his wounded arm with strips torn from her own shirt. "He's lying," Carmen said, but her voice carried no conviction. Frank shook his head slowly. The truth was settling into his bones like winter cold, explaining 35 years of phantom guilt and deliberately constructed isolation. Every therapy session where he dissected his failure to save Rodriguez and Patterson. Every sleepless night replaying the explosion's timing. Every careful lie he'd told Beth about his past. All of it orchestrated by handlers who'd understood that a guilty man was easier to control than a dead one. "No," Frank said, forcing himself to stand. "He's not." Through the broken windows, the helicopter sounds had shifted from search patterns to holding positions. Marcus was giving him time to process the revelation, to fully comprehend how completely he'd been manipulated. It was a psychological operation as precise as any Frank had ever witnessed, designed to strip away the last vestiges of the man who'd believed saving Elena Vasquez had been his one moment of moral courage. Carmen opened her mother's journal, pages fluttering in the dusty air currents. "If this is all evidence of American crimes, if they've been chasing it for 35 years, then we're the only leverage you have left." Frank studied her face, seeing Elena's stubborn intelligence wrestling with the same impossible mathematics he'd been calculating since Marcus's call ended. "They can't kill us here, not in broad daylight in the middle of Virginia. Too many witnesses, too many questions." But even as he said it, Frank was remembering other operations where witnesses had suffered convenient accidents, where questions had been buried beneath official explanations that satisfied everyone except the families of the dead. The agency had spent decades perfecting the art of making problems disappear without creating new ones. His phone buzzed with a text from Beth. Meeting ended early. Home in 20 minutes. Love you. 20 minutes. Frank's chest constricted as he calculated response times and operational protocols. Beth would pull into their driveway expecting to find her husband sorting inventory or helping customers with paint color selections. Instead, she'd find federal agents who'd spent hours preparing explanations for why Frank Garrison was a national security threat who'd endangered everyone who'd ever trusted him. "I have to warn her," Frank said, reaching for his phone. Carmen caught his wrist. "They're monitoring everything. The moment you make contact, they'll know where we are." She was right, but the knowledge felt like swallowing broken glass. Somewhere in his suburban neighborhood, tactical teams were probably already positioning themselves around his house, waiting for Beth's Honda Civic to turn the corner. They'd let her enter, let her discover the chaos Frank had brought into their carefully ordered life, before approaching with condolences and classified briefings about the man she'd never really known. 35 years, Frank said, more to himself than Carmen. 35 years of marriage therapy and antidepressants, and lying awake at 3 in the morning wondering what I could have done differently. And it was all theater. Carmen stood, brushing dust from her knees. Elena's journal remained clutched against her chest, but something had shifted in her posture. The hunted desperation was being replaced by something harder, more focused. Frank recognized the transformation because he'd seen it in Elena's eyes the night everything changed. "My mother spent 34 years running from them," Carmen said, changing identities, moving cities, always looking over her shoulder. She thought she was protecting this journal, protecting the evidence of what they did to my grandfather and those other people. She was. Carmen's voice carried a certainty that reminded Frank why Elena Vasquez had survived when so many others hadn't. She was protecting me. Everything she did, every sacrifice she made, was about keeping me alive long enough to finish what she started. Frank understood then what Carmen was suggesting, and the tactical part of his mind immediately began cataloging the impossibilities. They were outnumbered, outgunned, and trapped in an abandoned building while helicopters circled overhead. Even if they escaped the immediate area, Marcus had the resources of the federal government and 35 years of preparation. Most importantly, he had Beth, whether she knew it yet or not. But Carmen was right about one thing. Her mother's journal represented more than historical evidence. It was proof of ongoing criminal conspiracy, documentation of American war crimes that would topple careers and trigger congressional investigations if it ever reached the right hands. The question was whether those hands existed, and whether Frank and Carmen could stay alive long enough to find them. Outside, a helicopter was descending toward the mill's parking area. Marcus had finished his psychological preparation. Now came the operational phase, where Frank would discover whether 15 years of hardware store domesticity had eroded the survival instincts that had once made him valuable enough to frame instead of simply killing. Frank heard the helicopter blades cutting through air with the mechanical precision of an execution drumroll. Through the mill's broken windows, he watched tactical teams deploying from unmarked vehicles, their movements choreographed with the efficiency of men who'd rehearsed this scenario countless times. But Marcus had made a critical miscalculation after 35 years of playing puppet master from the shadows. He'd revealed himself. "The loading dock," Frank said, grabbing Carmen's hand. The journal pressed between them as they moved through the mill's industrial skeleton, past machines that had once transformed raw cotton into the fabric of American prosperity. Now they were navigation points in a battlefield that stretched back to a Colombian laboratory where Frank's real education had begun. Behind them, boots echoed against concrete as the tactical teams entered the building. Professional, unhurried. They believed they were collecting a broken old man and a frightened young woman who'd run out of places to hide. They didn't understand that Frank Garrison had spent 15 years preparing for this moment without realizing it. Every inventory system at the hardware store was a lesson in resource management. Every customer interaction had been practice in reading people under stress. Every night lying awake beside Beth, reconstructing Operation Nightfall in his mind, had been tactical analysis disguised as guilt. Marcus had created the perfect deep-cover operative by trying to destroy one. "Here," Frank whispered, pulling Carmen behind an industrial air conditioning unit that provided cover and a clear view of the loading dock. The helicopter was settling onto asphalt that hadn't seen maintenance since the mill closed. Frank could see Marcus through the aircraft's window. Older, grayer, but wearing the same expression of controlled superiority that had made him the CIA's golden boy in 1987. "He thinks you're still the man who saved my mother," Carmen said, reading Frank's assessment of their tactical situation. "I am that man." Frank checked his weapon, muscle memory guiding his hands through functions he'd practiced 10,000 times in another life. "But I'm also the one who spent 35 years learning what that choice really cost." The tactical teams were methodical, clearing each section of the mill with textbook precision. But they were looking for civilians in hiding, not an operator who understood their patterns. Frank had taught some of these techniques at Langley before Columbia changed everything. Now his own lessons were being used to hunt him. His phone buzzed, another text from Beth, running late. 25 minutes now, traffic on 64. Frank felt something break apart inside his chest, then rebuild itself into something harder. Beth's delay wasn't accident. It was Providence giving him exactly enough time to end this properly. Not the way Marcus had scripted it, with Frank disappearing into a black site while his wife mourned another carefully constructed lie. But the way it should have ended 35 years ago, when a young operative discovered that following orders sometimes meant abandoning everything that made you human. "When I signal," Frank told Carmen, "you run for the tree line. Don't stop, don't look back. There's a state highway 2 miles north. Flag down any car with Virginia plates. What about you?" Frank was already moving, using the mill's machinery as cover while he flanked the tactical teams. They expected him to run or surrender. They didn't expect him to advance on superior numbers with nothing but righteous anger and a 15-year understanding of his own expendability. "I'm going to have a conversation with an old friend." The first team never saw Frank coming. He moved through their perimeter like smoke, appearing behind their point man with the Glock pressed against the base of the man's skull before the others realized their formation had been compromised. "Stand down," Frank called, his voice carrying the authority of someone who trained these men's instructors. Weapons on the ground, hands visible. Marcus's voice crackled through their radios. "Do not comply. Target is psychologically compromised. Use of force is authorized." But Frank had read their faces correctly. These were federal agents, not mercenaries. They followed rules of engagement that didn't include executing former CIA operatives without due process, regardless of what their handler wanted. "I'm walking to that helicopter," Frank announced, moving backward toward the loading dock while keeping the point man between himself and the other agents. "Anyone who tries to stop me is going to have some very uncomfortable conversations with congressional oversight committees." Through the helicopter's windscreen, Frank could see Marcus speaking rapidly into a radio, his composure finally cracking. 35 years of careful manipulation were unraveling because Marcus had forgotten the fundamental truth about psychological operations. They only work when the target doesn't know he's being played. Frank reached the helicopter as Carmen broke from cover, running for the tree line with Elena's journal clutched against her chest. She moved like her mother, quick, purposeful, impossible to catch once she decided to run. The tactical teams were shouting contradictory orders, their command structure dissolving as Frank opened the helicopter's door and pressed his weapon against Marcus's temple. "Hello, old friend," Frank said. "Let's finish this conversation properly." Frank slid into the helicopter's passenger seat, keeping his weapon trained on Marcus while the rotors continued their hypnotic rhythm overhead. Through the windscreen, he watched Carmen disappear into the Virginia pines, Elena's journal clutched against her chest like a prayer book. The tactical teams had stopped pursuing her. Without clear orders from Marcus, they were paralyzed by rules of engagement that didn't cover shooting fleeing civilians. 35 years, Frank said, studying the man who'd orchestrated his entire adult life. Marcus looked smaller somehow, diminished by proximity to the truth he'd spent decades obscuring. 35 years of you pulling strings while I danced. Marcus's hands rested carefully on his knees, the picture of cooperation, but his eyes held the same cold calculation Frank remembered from Colombia. You were always too sentimental for this work, Francisco. That's why you were perfect for the role of the guilty survivor, the role of the man who could live with it. Marcus's voice carried a note of something that might have been respect. Do you have any idea how many operatives we evaluated for Operation Nightfall? How many psychological profiles we reviewed before selecting your team? Frank didn't answer. Outside the helicopter, federal agents maintained their positions but kept their weapons lowered. The situation had moved beyond their training into territory that required political decisions from people much higher up the chain of command. Rodriguez would have broken under interrogation, Marcus continued. Patterson would have written a book. Zhang would have leaked everything to the Washington Post within 6 months. But you were the only one with enough conscience to carry the guilt and enough discipline to carry it quietly. Until now. Marcus smiled, the expression devoid of warmth. Even now, you're not exposing anything. That girl is running through the woods with a journal full of evidence that disappeared decades ago. No congressional committee will touch it. No prosecutor will pursue it. Too many careers built on Operation Nightfall's official story. Frank felt the weight of Marcus's words, but something had changed during his 15 years behind the counter at Garrison Hardware. Every customer who trusted him with their small problems had been a deposit in an account Frank hadn't known he was building. Every honest transaction, every fair deal, every moment of genuine human connection had been writing over the lie Marcus had programmed into his soul. Maybe you're right, Frank said. Maybe the journal won't bring down the system, but Carmen's alive and she knows the truth. That's more than Elena had when she died. Elena died because she was weak, because she let sentiment override operational security. Marcus leaned forward slightly, testing Frank's resolve, just like you're doing now. Frank's phone buzzed again. Another text from Beth, almost home. Love you. She doesn't know, Frank said. About Colombia? No. But she will, when this is over. We'll make sure she understands exactly what kind of man she married, what kind of man she trusted with her heart. The threat hung in the helicopter's confined space like cordite smoke. Frank understood that Marcus was offering him the same deal he'd been unconsciously accepting for 35 years. Silence in exchange for a carefully constructed normal life. The only difference was that now the terms were explicit. You want me to disappear, Frank said. I want you to remember who you really are. Not the hardware store owner with the suburban house and the loving wife. Not the guilty survivor who saved one innocent life in a warehouse full of atrocities. You're CIA, Frank. You always were. And CIA takes care of its own, even the ones who forget their place. Through the trees, Frank could see flashing lights approaching on the state highway. Carmen had reached civilization, had probably flagged down exactly the kind of ordinary citizen Frank had been pretending to be for 15 years. The journal would make its way to journalists, to politicians, to people who might care more about truth than institutional preservation. Or Marcus might be right. Maybe the system was too entrenched, too well protected by mutually assured destruction and compartmentalized guilt. Maybe Elena's daughter would spend the rest of her life running from the same shadows that had consumed her mother. But Frank realized he didn't care about the outcome anymore. For 35 years, he'd measured his worth by the lives he'd failed to save in Colombia. Now he understood that salvation wasn't about controlling consequences. It was about making choices that let you live with the person staring back from the mirror. Frank lowered his weapon and opened the helicopter door. "Tell your people to let me walk away." Marcus's composure finally cracked completely. "You're making a mistake, Francisco. The same mistake that got your team killed." "No," Frank said, stepping down onto the loading dock. "I'm making the choice I should have made in 1987. He walked away from the helicopter toward the sound of sirens and the possibility of a truth that might survive even if he didn't. Behind him, Marcus was shouting orders into his radio, but the words seemed to come from a different world entirely, one Frank had finally stopped inhabiting.